In the winter of 27 BC, when Augustus claimed the title of Rome's first emperor, the empire entered a new political age. But hidden beneath the glory of marble temples, military parades, and triumphant eagles was a darker, unspoken world. It was a world where male concubines, often boys taken from conquered lands, lived lives that were both invisible and indispensable. Their suffering was routine, expected, and disturbingly normalized in Roman elite society. This system did not begin suddenly. It evolved out of centuries of Roman militarism, slavery, and social hierarchy. By the time emperors like Augustus, Tiberius, and Nero ruled, the use of male concubines in wealthy households had become so common that few questioned the cruelty involved. Those who benefited saw it as their right. Those who suffered had no voice at all. To understand this world, one must imagine Rome at its height, crowded streets echoing with vendors' cries, senators wrapped in spotless togas, legions marching home from distant wars, and behind closed doors, rooms where enslaved boys lived under strict surveillance. They had no control over their bodies, their time, or their futures. Their existence reflected the deep inequalities that defined Roman life. Inequalities so extreme that even many Romans felt uneasy, though never enough to challenge the system. Most male concubines in Rome were not born slaves. Many were captured during wars. Others were bought from traders who scoured the edges of the empire, Germanic forests, the mountains of Thrace, the plains of Gaul, the cities of Greece. Boys with delicate features or unusual beauty were especially targeted. Their value was high, and wealthy Romans paid enormous sums to own them. In the Roman mind, beauty was not simply aesthetic. It was status. To possess a concubine whose appearance impressed guests was a sign of wealth and power. The boys themselves had no say in this. Their selection was often based on the cruel assessments of traders who examined them as though they were livestock. Some concubines were castrated before arriving in Rome. Others were castrated after sale. This practice, though technically illegal under early Roman law, became common as the empire expanded. Eunuchs were considered more obedient, less threatening, and more valuable. They were also believed to remain physically attractive longer, which increased their appeal to households obsessed with appearances. For these boys, the process was often fatal. Those who survived carried lifelong pain or deformities. But in Rome's wealthiest districts, on the Palatine Hill, in the mansions of senators, in the villas of generals, such suffering was rarely acknowledged. To many Roman elites, it was simply the price of luxury. Once purchased, a male concubine's life was strictly regulated. He lived under constant oversight. His sleeping quarters were usually small, windowless rooms near the master's private chambers. He was expected to be available at any time, day or night, whether for personal service, companionship, or humiliation. The Roman household, or domus, was a carefully structured ecosystem. The master was absolute. The concubine was at the very bottom, lower than household slaves who cooked, cleaned, or maintained the estate. This was because concubines were considered personal property, reserved for intimate use, and thus restricted from forming friendships or alliances. They were denied education unless the master desired entertainment. They were denied free movement. They were denied relationships. The goal was to keep them isolated and compliant. In many households, concubines were monitored by older slaves who enforced rules with violence. Whipping, branding, or shaving a concubine's head as punishment was normal. For elite Romans, discipline was essential to maintain control. One of the most disturbing aspects of life as a male concubine was the humiliation expected of them. Rome was a culture where power was displayed through domination. Concubines were frequently required to serve during banquets, standing silently while guests laughed, drank, and boasted of military achievements. Some were forced to entertain visitors with music, poetry, or dance. Others were deliberately mocked for their foreign origins, accents, or youth. The more humiliating the display, the more powerful the master appeared to his peers. This humiliating environment was not accidental. It reinforced a hierarchy designed to remind everyone, women, slaves, children, and concubines, of their place. While concubines existed across Rome, the imperial palace was infamous for its use of them. Several emperors openly kept male concubines, which made the practice even more visible and more normalized. Emperor Tiberius maintained an entire island retreat on Capri, where enslaved youths served him. Ancient sources describe the island as a place where humiliation and exploitation were routine. Emperor Nero conducted one of the most shocking acts in Roman history by publicly marrying a castrated boy named Sporus. He dressed Sporus as an empress, paraded him through Rome, and threatened anyone who mocked the arrangement. Though historians debate the details, the event reveals how deeply entrenched such exploitation was. These imperial behaviors influenced wealthy families across the empire. If emperors did it openly, then aristocrats felt justified doing it privately. Male concubines are rarely discussed in popular history, yet they reveal important truths about Roman society. They show the brutality beneath Rome's polished image. They expose the immense power imbalances that shaped daily life. They highlight how normalized cruelty can become when supported by law, tradition, and social expectation. This world, hidden in shadows, yet woven into Roman culture, remained largely unchanged until the decline of the empire. By the height of the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE, the life of a male concubine had become a carefully constructed system of control. It was not random cruelty, but an organized lifestyle shaped by Roman law, custom, and the desires of wealthy elites. To understand how horrifying this world was, we must step directly inside a Roman household, into the spaces where these boys lived, served, and suffered. Once a boy entered a Roman household as a concubine, the first lesson he learned was this: his body did not belong to him. Roman law treated enslaved people as property, and male concubines were the most personal category of that property. They were expected to be available at all times. They were not permitted to refuse orders, express emotions, form friendships, or even display discomfort. The master's word was absolute. If the master was a senator, a general, or a wealthy merchant, his authority was considered unquestionable. Roman society was built on hierarchy, and the concubine was placed at the very bottom of that structure. These rules were so deeply ingrained that few Romans questioned them. The elites viewed the presence of concubines as a sign of sophistication and social status. It was common for guests to admire a household's slaves the same way they commented on beautiful mosaics or expensive sculptures. But unlike a mosaic, a concubine could feel pain, and that pain shaped every moment of his day. Most male concubines were young, often between 10 and 16, when they entered a household. Their training began immediately. They were taught to walk quietly, to lower their eyes, and to respond instantly to orders. They learned the household schedule, meals, meetings, gatherings, the master's habits, and the routines of visitors. They were trained to anticipate needs before being told. This training was enforced with punishment. Whipping was the most common form. Roman households often kept instruments designed for discipline, leather straps, wooden rods, small sticks that delivered sharp blows. Branding was used as a mark of ownership, usually on the shoulder or arm. A concubine could be punished for speaking too much, not speaking enough, walking too slowly, or even appearing anxious in the presence of guests. The training created obedience, but it also destroyed individuality. The goal was to make the boy forget that he ever had a life outside the household. Isolation was one of the most powerful tools used to control concubines. Unlike other enslaved people who worked in kitchens, gardens, or workshops, concubines were kept separate. Their quarters were often near the master's private rooms, not near other slaves. They were forbidden to interact with workers who might develop sympathy for them. This isolation ensured two things. The concubine remained entirely dependent on the master. There was no opportunity to form alliances or friendships that could inspire rebellion. Roman elites understood that a concubine with allies was dangerous, not because he could resist physically, but because solidarity created hope, and hope encouraged disobedience. By denying concubines companionship, they prevented them from imagining alternatives to their situation. A concubine's daily life was shaped by unpredictability. He could be summoned at any time, during meals, political discussions, private gatherings, or late at night. This unpredictability was deliberate. It reinforced the idea that the concubine existed solely for the master's convenience. Concubines were expected to maintain perfect grooming. Their hair was kept trimmed or styled according to the master's preference. Their skin had to be kept clean and free of marks, though the hypocrisy of this expectation was obvious, since punishments often left bruises or scars. Some concubines were dressed in fine clothing when guests arrived, but only as decoration. Others were dressed plainly to emphasize their submission. Every detail, down to their posture and the position of their hands, was instructed and monitored. Roman culture valued dominance. For powerful men, the humiliation of a concubine was an open display of superiority. Because of this, many households incorporated humiliating tasks into the concubine's responsibilities. He stood behind the master's chair during meals, silent and motionless. He served guests personally, often bending or kneeling in ways that emphasized his vulnerability. He was required to endure mockery from guests and sometimes even from other slaves. He was prohibited from showing emotion, even when laughed at or insulted. In some households, guests were encouraged to comment on a concubine's appearance, much like one might discuss the quality of wine or the craftsmanship of a table. These conversations were held in front of the concubine, treating him as though he were an object incapable of hearing or understanding. The humiliation was not accidental. It was a tool used to maintain psychological control. In Roman society, violence was not considered unusual. Gladiatorial games, public executions, and corporal punishment were part of daily life. Within households, violence was seen as a legitimate form of discipline. Concubines often faced harsher treatment than other slaves, not because they disobeyed more often, but because their roles were more personal. If a concubine displayed fear or hesitation, the master might interpret it as disrespect. Common punishments included whipping with leather thongs, beating with wooden rods, forced kneeling on hard stone surfaces, shaving the head as a public mark of disgrace, confinement in dark storage rooms, denial of food or water. More severe punishments were rare but possible. Rome had no legal protections for enslaved people. If a master caused injury, even death, there was no penalty unless it threatened public order. This environment created a culture where violence was not just accepted, it was normalized. The most dangerous households for concubines were those belonging to political figures. Senators, generals, and governors often used concubines not only for personal pleasure, but for political advantage. During banquets, where alliances were formed and broken, concubines served as visible symbols of a master's wealth and sophistication. Their presence subtly reinforced the message that the master was powerful enough to own beauty, youth, and obedience. In these households, concubines were expected to be perfect. A single mistake, dropping a cup, spilling wine, hesitating, could embarrass the master in front of influential guests. The consequences were severe. Some concubines were forced to participate in lavish parties where drunk guests mocked, grabbed, or ridiculed them. Even the slightest reaction could result in punishment later. One might assume that Roman women opposed the presence of male concubines, but the reality was more complicated. Some mistresses resented concubines and punished them harshly in private. Others treated them with indifference, regarding them simply as part of the household. A few elite women even kept male concubines of their own, especially widows or political figures who maintained private estates. Roman society judged women more harshly for this, but the practice existed nonetheless. For the boys trapped in these households, the mistress could be either a source of additional cruelty or a rare source of sympathy, though sympathy was uncommon. The ultimate purpose of the concubine system was to break individuality. A concubine's former name was often taken from him. He was given a new name chosen for convenience, beauty, or mockery. His birthday was not celebrated. His homeland was rarely acknowledged. His memories were either ignored or erased through constant discipline and humiliation. By the time a concubine reached adulthood, he often no longer recognized the person he once was. Many were discarded, sold, or reassigned once their beauty faded. Only a few gained freedom, and fewer still managed to build lives afterward. The destruction of identity was not merely a consequence of concubinage, it was the goal. By the middle of the 1st century CE, Rome's political landscape had become deeply intertwined with the exploitation of enslaved youths. Male concubines were no longer hidden figures serving quietly inside aristocratic homes. They had become symbols of elite indulgence, political theatre, and imperial excess. Nowhere was this more visible than in the palaces of Rome's emperors. To understand how male concubines became normalized at the highest levels of society, we must enter the world of imperial Rome, a world of marble halls, whispering courtiers, suspicious guards, and emperors whose power could reshape the lives of millions. The Roman imperial court was not merely an administrative center. It was a battlefield of influence where senators, generals, wealthy freedmen, and foreign ambassadors all competed for the emperor's attention. Within this environment, concubines played an unexpectedly important role. Young, attractive enslaved boys became personal attendants, symbols of the emperor's wealth. Gifts used to win favor targets for political gossip, witnesses to dangerous conversations. Many emperors kept multiple concubines, and the way they treated them set the tone for the rest of the empire. Elite. The reign of Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 CE, is one of the most infamous chapters in the history of Roman concubinage. When he retreated to the island of Capri in his later years, he brought with him a group of enslaved youths whose lives became the subject of horrified Roman rumor. Ancient writers described an environment where boys were trained to obey without hesitation, humiliation was considered entertainment, punishments were harsh and unpredictable. While historians debate the accuracy of these accounts, they agree on one thing: Tiberius normalized the idea that emperors could treat enslaved youths however they wished, with no moral or legal boundaries. This attitude spread throughout the aristocracy. If the emperor himself maintained concubines openly, then other powerful men felt justified doing the same. Tiberius' successor, Caligula, brought a new level of public cruelty to the imperial palace. His short rule, 37-41 CE, became notorious for excess, fear, and instability. Concubines in Caligula's palace faced a uniquely dangerous environment because Caligula enjoyed using humiliation as public entertainment. He often forced young male slaves to serve at feasts where senators, military officers, and foreign dignitaries watched. He mocked them openly, sometimes changing their clothing, hairstyles, or names to amuse himself. A single mistake could result in sudden punishment or public embarrassment. For concubines in Caligula's palace, every day was unpredictable. They lived with constant fear, knowing that their lives depended on the emperor's mood. Perhaps the most disturbing story of Roman male concubinage is the case of Sporus, a young boy who became the obsession of Emperor Nero. Ancient historians describe how Nero had the boy castrated and then declared him his wife. Nero dressed Sporus in royal clothing, gave him the title of empress, and paraded him before the Roman people. Nero's treatment of Sporus revealed the darkest side of imperial power. The ability to reshape reality, the ability to rewrite a person's identity, the ability to use a human being as a political symbol for the aristocracy. Nero's actions sent a message. If the emperor could do this openly, then the rest of Rome could continue exploiting concubines in private. Sporus became one of history's most tragic figures, living not as a person, but as a symbol of the emperor's authority and madness. When Nero died, Sporus was passed among other powerful Romans until he finally took his own life rather than face further humiliation. Later emperors, such as Domitian and Hadrian, continued the practice of keeping male concubines, though with less cruelty. Hadrian's relationship with Antinous, a young Greek man, became one of the most famous love stories of ancient Rome, but even this seemingly affectionate relationship revealed the unequal power dynamics of the system. Antinous was adored, honored, and eventually deified after his mysterious death, but he was still, at his core, a young man whose life was entirely controlled by the emperor. Even when an emperor treated a concubine kindly, the imbalance of power was absolute. A concubine's comfort or suffering depended entirely on the will of the ruler. The behavior of emperors influenced the aristocracy across the empire. Roman nobles copied imperial habits because the emperor set social fashion. Behaving like the emperor signaled status. Excess was seen as a mark of power. Cruelty showed dominance as a result. Senators kept concubines to impress guests. Generals brought concubines on military campaigns. Wealthy merchants gave concubines as gifts. Governors used concubines to intimidate rivals. The practice became so deeply entrenched that no one imagined a world without it. In political households, concubines were more than servants. They were strategic tools. They overheard conversations that could topple governments. They witnessed conspiracies, betrayals, and secret deals. They carried messages between courtiers. They were threats to rivals who feared being reported by them. Some concubines accidentally became involved in political plots. Others were punished or killed simply because they knew too much. In a world where one careless whisper could cost a senator his life, concubines lived in constant fear of being used or sacrificed in political games they barely understood. Roman writers, philosophers, and lawmakers created several arguments to defend the system. They claimed concubines were property, not people. They argued that enslaved youths benefited from living in wealthy homes. They insisted that beauty justified ownership. They taught that submission was the natural role of conquered peoples. These arguments allowed Roman elites to ignore the suffering of concubines and maintain the illusion that the system was civilized. In reality, it was a form of violence woven into the fabric of Roman society. When we examine the lives of Roman male concubines, we uncover truths Rome tried to hide. Power in Rome depended on domination. Roman culture rewarded cruelty when it maintained order. Beauty became a justification for suffering. Conquest created victims whose pain was invisible to their masters. This system did not collapse because Romans found it immoral. It collapsed only when the empire itself began to fall. By the 3rd century CE, Rome had reached a point of cultural and political transformation. The empire was still powerful, but internal pressures, rebellions, and shifting moral landscapes were beginning to expose the cracks in Roman society. Among the countless hidden worlds affected by these changes was the system of male concubinage, a system built on domination, suffering, and silence. To understand how this system eventually faded, we must examine its destruction from within Rome's collapsing foundations, its abandonment under rising religious forces, and its haunting legacy that still shapes modern discussions about slavery, power, and human dignity. As wars grew longer and borders became unstable, Rome faced a new problem. Fewer young boys were being captured and sold into elite households. Entire regions that once supplied slaves were now either lost, rebellious, or impoverished to the point of collapse. Slave traders could no longer guarantee a steady supply of beautiful youths, which raised prices dramatically. This scarcity had two effects. The wealthy monopolized the remaining concubines. Families with moderate wealth could no longer afford them. What had once been a common display of elite luxury began to shrink into the inner circles of the ultra-rich. However, scarcity did not improve the lives of concubines. In fact, it often made things worse, as elite masters became more possessive and more controlling. At the same time, Roman philosophers, especially followers of the Stoic school, began raising subtle objections to the treatment of enslaved people. Stoicism taught that all humans shared a universal spark of reason and were therefore equal in their capacity for virtue. Philosophers like Seneca and Musonius Rufus never attacked the institution of slavery directly, but their writings questioned extreme cruelty. They urged masters to treat enslaved people with dignity and warned that power without restraint corrupted the soul. Though they did not aim to abolish concubinage, their teachings created the first intellectual discomfort around how elites treated enslaved youths. A few Roman families quietly reduced their reliance on concubines. Others began freeing older concubines after years of service, but most elite households ignored the philosophers, convinced that social hierarchy must be preserved. The most dramatic shift came with the rise of Christianity, which spread rapidly across the empire during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Early Christian teachings rejected many elements of elite Roman culture, including the open exploitation of slaves for pleasure. Christian leaders condemned concubinage for several reasons. It conflicted with the idea that all souls were equal under God. It involved cruelty and dominance, which Christian morality disapproved of. It encouraged what religious leaders saw as immoral behavior. It threatened the Christian model of marriage and family. By the time Christianity became the dominant religion in the 4th century, public opinion had begun to shift. Many aristocrats converted for political reasons, not moral ones, but conversion forced them to adopt new social expectations. Owning male concubines no longer symbolized wealth or sophistication. It signaled spiritual corruption. This pressure pushed concubinage out of public view. It continued privately for decades, but without the social approval it once enjoyed. As Christianity influenced Roman law, emperors began issuing edicts aimed at reforming social behavior. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, issued laws encouraging the humane treatment of slaves. Later emperors restricted forms of cruelty, limited the sale of children, and encouraged manumission. Although these laws were imperfectly enforced, they signaled a new direction. The imperial government no longer supported the traditions that once enabled concubinage. By the 5th century, concubinage was no longer a culturally acceptable part of elite life. What happened to concubines who survived long enough to see the system fade? Many were quietly freed. Some became household servants in other roles. A few, especially those who received education, became scribes, tutors, or secretaries. Others drifted into poverty, lacking family connections or social support. Rome offered little help to freed slaves, regardless of how they had been used. Some concubines fled the households that once owned them, seeking anonymity in the crowded districts of Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, or Constantinople. Their stories are largely lost to history, but archaeological and written traces suggest that some managed to build modest lives. A rare few rose far above their origins. Some became trusted advisors to wealthy patrons. Others became wealthy merchants after gaining freedom. A small number even became influential political players, using their intimate knowledge of elite households to build new identities. But for most, freedom meant simply survival. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, the entire cultural structure that supported concubinage disintegrated. The aristocratic households that once kept concubines were destroyed, abandoned, or stripped of wealth. Christian leaders now controlled moral authority in Europe. They rejected Roman sexual customs and emphasized family structure, which left no room for the concubine system. As new kingdoms rose from the ruins of Rome, they brought new social codes, new laws, and new moral expectations. In the East, the Byzantine Empire survived, but it too abandoned the Roman concubine culture under Christian influence. Enslaved servants still existed, but the specific role of male concubine faded into history. By the early Middle Ages, the system had vanished almost completely. The story of Roman male concubines is shocking, disturbing, and often ignored. For centuries, historians avoided the topic because it revealed the darker, uncomfortable truths of Rome, truths that contradicted the idealized image of marble temples, fearless legions, and philosophical greatness. Rome gave the world great innovations, but it also normalized cruelty that modern society finds horrifying. The suffering of male concubines was a deliberate product of a system designed to celebrate dominance. Their stories did not survive because they could not write them. Their voices were erased because their existence threatened Rome's heroic mythology. Understanding this forgotten world is crucial because it reminds us, power without accountability becomes tyranny. Normalization of cruelty is dangerous, regardless of culture or era. Victims of history often leave no written record, but their experiences shaped the world we inherited. Even great civilizations can be built on the suffering of the weak. The Roman Empire is remembered for law, architecture, military brilliance, and political innovation. But its legacy is incomplete without acknowledging the hidden lives of those it crushed. The concubine's suffering reveals what Rome truly was beneath the marble, a society built on inequality so extreme that entire groups lived and died without recognition. Today, historians piece together their story from fragments, ancient texts, legal documents, scattered inscriptions, and brief mentions in biographies of emperors. Each fragment is a reminder that even the most powerful empires have shadows, and those shadows often expose more truth than triumphs. The world of Roman male concubines may be gone, but its echo remains. It challenges the way we view ancient Rome, forces us to confront the brutality behind its glory, and reminds us that human suffering can be hidden behind the walls of even the greatest civilizations. Their story survived only in whispers, yet those whispers speak volumes.